All right, continuing on with section three today. We will finish it today. We're going to pick up where we left off with how Americans are going to end up picking sides during the American Civil War. So, when the war began, each side was convinced that its cause was just and it was the right reason. So, we're going to start with the South. So, Southerners believed states had the right to leave the Union, and they called the conflict the War for Southern Independence. So, as you can tell, they're fighting for their freedom. White settlers wanted independence so that they, sorry, white Southerners wanted their independence so that they could keep their traditional way of life, including slavery. And they also thought the North had caused the war and therefore called it the War of Northern Aggression. So the South referred to it as several different things: the War for Southern Independence or the War of Northern Aggression when they decided to blame the North for starting the war, which technically the North didn't do, as we talked about yesterday with Fort Sumter. Northerners believed that they were fighting to save the Union. So they weren't fighting to keep the Southern way of life or independence. They were fighting to keep the United States together. Abolishing slavery was also not an official goal, and many Northerners, guided by racism, would actually approve of slavery. So most Northerners really didn't want to necessarily get rid of slavery. They mainly because of racism and racist beliefs they had at the time. So it's going to kind of create conflicting issues. So in April of 1861, eight slave states had not yet decided whether to remain in the Union. And if you look at the map on page 507, you will see those states are Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. So, that being said, they are the darker shaded states on that map. These states had more than half of the South's population and food crops, and many of the South's factories were also located in these states. So it's going to be very crucial to the South to try to get them to join their side because of those factories and the fact they grow a lot of food compared to the other southern states, which we will be talking about in a little bit. It's also important to the North that the South does not get these resources. So they would be important assets to whichever side they join based on population and food production. For these states, four of these states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, will quickly join the Confederacy right after the war breaks out. However, the others, after some indecision, will join um, the Union, and these border states, as they will be known as, is Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware. And the reason why they're called border states is because they formed the border between the North and the South, or the Confederacy and the Union. So strengths and weaknesses in the North and South, both sides of the Civil War will have strengths and weaknesses, obviously. The South also had the advantage of fighting a defensive war because if the North did not move its forces into the South, well, the Confederacy would remain a separate country. So basically, what this means is all the South had to do is defend the southern states and they could win the war. However, they're going to have a lot of things working against them as well as for them with this defensive strategy. So we're going to start with southern strength. So white Southerners believed that they were fighting a war for independence similar to the American Revolution and that they were defending their homeland and their way of life, giving them a strong reason to fight. So the South has a really strong reason to fight. Confederate soldiers also knew the southern countryside better than, and the friendly civilians aided them as guides, which is a huge, huge boost. However, the South had an agrarian or farming economy, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but they grew cash crops instead of food crops. So you can't really sit there and eat cotton, corn, or cotton, tobacco, and those kind of things. So unfortunately, because they relied on cash crops, not actual food, um, it's going to be very difficult for them to be able to feed everybody. Also, the South had very few factories to produce weapons and other vital supplies, and also few railroads to move troops and supplies, which is also going to be super critical come later on. So, not only does the South lack food or the ability to produce war goods, or be able to move troops and supplies around easily, that's going to be very critical things to the war and their success. The railroads it did have oftentimes didn't connect to each other either because they're all privately owned. Therefore, those owners basically refused to work together. The South also had a political problem. The Confederate Constitution favored states' rights, and limited the authority of the central government. Very, very similar to the Articles of Confederation. And if people would have paid a little bit more attention in history, they probably wouldn't have made that mistake again, because this created a problem for the central government in trying to get things done. One example of this that the book gives is that representatives from Georgia made a statement saying only military leaders from Georgia can command troops from Georgia. And a lot of other states felt the same way, making it very difficult to organize the army. And the South also had a small population and one-third of the available people to serve in the military. Now, if you look at the chart on page 508, the North and South, population-wise, North has about 27.7 million people, South 8.73 million. North has roughly just over 3 times as many people living there, therefore they have about 3 times as many people to be able to fight in the war, which gives them a huge advantage just in sheer numbers. Now, the North had many people to grow food and work in factories, but the war was unpopular among Northerners, and extremely high war casualties will continue to make it unpopular. So, the North did look like they were actually losing the war for a period of time, and while this made the war super unpopular there and very hard to recruit soldiers to fight in the war. And the North's biggest advantage, though, was its strong industrial economy. They had 10 times the industrial capacity as the South and had more than double the miles of railroad line, which was used to transport troops and supplies. So not only could they produce 10 times as many goods as the South, that means they're producing 10 times as many guns, bullets, uniforms, shoes, you name it, they can produce more of it. They also have the capability of transporting all those supplies they're producing and the troops to where they need them to be because they have a better developed railroad system. They were also able to produce more food than the South because of, well, the Ohio River Valley is a very, in Iowa and the Great Plains produce a lot of food crops, not cash crops. Therefore, they have an ample amount of food ready to and available for them. The North also had a strong navy and a large fleet of trading ships, creating a balance in naval warfare. So not only did the North have a much, much stronger navy than the South, but well, they had a fleet of trading ships that allowed them to actually trade with other countries for supplies that they might need. The North also had West Point to train officers throughout the war. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the best officers and the most experienced are from southern states. Therefore, they will remain with their southern states, as you will talk about at the end with Robert E. Lee. But the North had the ability to train officers throughout the war now because West Point was located in the North. And the North did have to go to the South to get them to rejoin the Union, which would prove difficult because they were invading unfamiliar land. And if you don't know a lot of things about the land you're invading, it's very difficult to win battles, as the North will find out in the coming section that we will be talking about. So, how will Lincoln and Davis lead their people? Well, President Davis and President Lincoln, and also military leaders on both sides, will play key roles in determining the war's outcome. And it's how the leaders um, handle this and the actions they take will have the most impact on the war. So many thought Davis would be a stronger leader than Lincoln, but Davis never really wanted to be president of the Confederate States. He just kind of wanted to be a citizen and maybe a senator or something. Davis's experience had prepared him for the position, though. He had attended the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and served as an officer in the Mexican American War and later as Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. So, in other words, Davis has a ton of experience in both leading a military and also in military combat experience, which gives him a huge advantage over Lincoln. Um, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. But Davis was also regarded as an honest and courageous and widely respected, but he did not like to turn over to other people the details of military planning. So as he's planning um, military expeditions and things like this, he doesn't really talk to other people and he doesn't get their input on it, which makes him kind of a weaker leader in those regards. When you compare that to Lincoln, um, and so at first, Northerners had doubts of Lincoln's ability to lead the president as president and commander in chief of the U.S. military because he had very little experience in national politics and military matters in general, as he's never served in the military. But he proved to be a patient and strong leader and a fine war planner because he was willing to listen and gain the respect of those around him. And this was mainly due to a sense of humor. And they noted that Lincoln even accepted criticism with a smile. So Lincoln was open to criticism, whereas Davis wasn't. And it's going to be very important that the chart on top of 510, you guys kind of put something like that in your notes so that way you know the differences between the leaders and their experience. So, Lincoln, very little experience about anything to do with military matters. Davis, ton of experience. However, Lincoln will be open to comments and also open to criticism and suggestions, whereas Davis isn't. And so, because Lincoln's more open than Davis, Lincoln will end up being the better military leader. Now, Robert E. Lee in the military. As the war began, as I said earlier, Army officers in the South had to decide whether to stay with the Union Army and fight against their home states or join the Confederate forces. And many of them would end up actually joining the Confederate forces instead of fighting against their own people. So Robert E. Lee of Virginia faced the dilemma when Lincoln asked him to command the Union Army, and his response was that he would wait to see whatever Virginia did, because Virginia at the time had not yet joined the Confederate States. But when it did, and Virginia will end up seceding, Lee would refuse Lincoln's offer. It would become the leader of the Confederate Army instead. So Robert E. Lee had a chance to be the head of the Union Army, but he decided that he's going to do whatever Virginia does and stand by Virginia's choice. So when Virginia secedes, Lee will join Virginia and become the leader of the Confederate Army. Now, many of the pre war United States Army's officers served the Confederacy, which is going to be a real problem because Lincoln is going to have trouble finding generals to match those of the South. The North just didn't start the war with very many experienced generals. And so, because of this, we're going to have a lot of talks in section 4 and 5 about how these inexperienced generals are going to contribute to a lot of early defeats for the Union and actually almost lose the war for the Union in the early years of the war. And you will start to see Lincoln's frustration with this. So, this is where I'll leave you off for today. Please make sure you take the quiz on the book website over section 3 today. And we will not have homework until Monday. Um, So have a good weekend. Enjoy your couple days off, and we will be back on Monday with more lessons.